Dear son, ages ago, during a time when America was obsessed with films about giant meteors destroying the planet, shortly before Game Boys had color, it was a dark time. Television sets were still lumbering monstrous things. Some weighed hundreds of pounds, and I went to college. College was a huge life changer for me. After 12 years of Catholic school, I was euphoric over wearing my own clothes instead of being confined to a uniform. The food was an improvement too. One of my biggest life-altering experiences, through voodoo magic, law of averages, or just blind luck, I somehow landed my first girlfriend. What first struck me about her, aside from her looks, was the fact she wasn't repulsed by my love for video games, science fiction, fantasy, comic books, and The Simpsons, over sports, popular music, and other generally extroverted things that extroverts do. Crazy. Up until that point, most women I encountered wanted nothing to do with someone who would rather play Final Fantasy than fantasy football. During winter break in 1998, my girlfriend and I returned to our respective homes, but agreed that we would try to meet up a few times, be introduced to each other's families, and exchange Christmas presents. I didn't have a car at the time, but she did, so unfortunately I had to rely on her for transportation. To make matters worse, it snowed that holiday break. A lot. To pass the time at home, I developed a wonderful addiction to Ultima Online. Ultima Online, in my eyes, was, and shall ever be, the greatest massive multiplayer online role-playing game. Open world exploring, no set classes, dozens of skill sets, awesome crafting, player housing, PvP, dedicated role-playing servers. It had it all. And while I was at home on my mom and dad's dial-up connection, I had it all. One snowy day while waiting for my girlfriend to arrive, I was hunting ophidians and watching the clock tick by. She was a habitually late person. For Christmas, my dad received what every father wanted in 1998, a 12-foot attic folding staircase assembly that he was going to place in the garage. My brother and I, if we were home, were automatically drafted into helping him with whatever he might have been working on at the time. Without consulting my brother before writing this, I can safely say that we are now both pros at holding flashlights because of our experiences. Someday, you will be too, son. My excuse for not helping this particular day was because I was wearing my nicest clothes and that my girlfriend should be arriving in, well, 30 minutes ago. I didn't want to get covered in mysterious garage grunge when I ventured out to meet her parents. I mean, come on. This was a big occasion. Turk, get out here. Wait, no. He was wearing real clothes this time. Let's just put some pants on, Dad. Yeah, there we go. Can't, Dad. She'll be here any minute. 20 minutes later, she still hadn't arrived. Rand, come on, my brother said. We can get this thing installed if you help. Really, man? I can't. She's already late, and we're gonna jet the moment she gets here. It wasn't long afterwards that my cousin, who somehow got drafted into the project, was sent in to see if he could coax me into the war. Rand, come on. This'll only take a few minutes. We almost got this. Fine, I said in a tone probably whinier than I wanted. I can help lift. The stairs were pretty heavy. It took all four of us to lift them properly, and that was before we even had a chance to take them up the ladder. I'm not sure who, but someone came up with the bright idea of opening the contraption before putting it into position, therefore making it simpler to install. All four of us nodded. Yeah, sounds right to me. Let's make this easier on ourselves. It's important to note here, before I go any further in the story, that the springs in drop-down ladders are remarkably strong. They need to hold a ton of weight because the entire folded wooden staircase rests on the door when it's not in use. The four of us took our positions in each corner of the unit, we pried open the massive door, and slowly started to shuffle towards the opening in the ceiling. Okay? Nobody drop it. Somebody dropped it. Inside one of the many hinges was my left hand. Without a word, everyone stepped forward and pried open the jaws of the steel and wooden alligator. My ring finger looked like a white grape that was dropped on the floor and then stepped on. It spurted blood. Twice. I clutched my finger with my right hand, stared at the mush on the former tip of my finger. And for the first time ever, I didn't care about what I was about to scream in the presence of my father. The There was a good deal of shuffling going on after that, but we got my finger wrapped up in a lot of paper towels and then sealed it off with duct tape at the base. It looked like I had a softball taped to my hand. I piled into the front seat of my dad's truck, where he and I proceeded to the hospital, which on a normal day would have taken us 30 minutes, but fueled by fear, my dad got us there in 15, despite the foot of snow on the ground. I've only seen my father scared 2 times. This was the first time. Our typical mode of communication in my late teens was either dead silence or grunting at each other, so when he suddenly turned into a super chatterbox, it was a massive transformation. The conversation went something like this. "My finger is really starting to throb," I said. "I'm sure it is. Hey, do you like these guys on the radio? Who is this, Poison or Whitesnake?" It's Whitesnake? "Oh yeah, I'm gonna turn it up. I always get confused. I mean, Whitesnakes are probably poisonous, and neither of these bands are nearly as scary as their names imply, but you know who else I really like? Kansas!" I'm sure he was trying to get my mind off the situation, or more likely his. We finally got to the hospital, where the softball on my hand had turned into a tomato. By the time we were reading magazines in the waiting room, my dad had calmed down considerably. An intern came and cleaned my finger and stitched me back up. By the 3rd stitch in, my girlfriend showed up in the ER. Ah. By the 8th stitch, she was already on her way back home. By the 11th stitch, I was quite certain that I could do the sutures myself, and I asked if I could do it. The intern said no. I was bummed. I was told that my fingernail would likely fall off. But it would most likely grow back. Yay. But would most likely come back ingrown. And I would have to wear a splint on my finger for at least 3 weeks. We got back into my dad's truck and drove home in the snow and in the dark, my dad apologizing for something he didn't do. But hey, for 6 whole hours we didn't drive each other nuts. And that's why it was the happiest Christmas ever. Wait, no, that's not how I want to transition this. Because of the stupid splint on my finger, I couldn't type and therefore play Ultima Online anymore. And to get my mind off the pain, I played The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, which had just been given to me as a Christmas gift. There we go! The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time released on November 23rd, 1998. Despite its release so close to the end of the year, it still sold 2.5 million copies that year. In fact, the game was in such high demand that over 500,000 pre-orders for the game were in place, which was triple the amount of any pre-ordered game prior to that date. Original pre-orders for the game came on a gold cartridge, but my copy was a standard Nintendo 64 Gray Edition that my mother and sisters picked up at a Walmart during the Black Friday rush. According to them, there were several other shoppers clamoring over one another at the store trying to get more than one copy so they could later punt them off on desperate parents looking for last-minute holiday gifts, at an inflated price, of course. I had been looking forward to Zelda 64 since it was originally teased in 1995 as a launch title for the 64DD, a disk drive add-on for the Nintendo 64 that never came to fruition. But if Zelda was on it, I was ready to shell out the bones for it. My favorite in the series to this day is The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, but what Link to the Past did right, Ocarina repeated its formula for success in the 3rd dimension. There may be a few naysayers out there who claim they dislike the game for one reason or another, but they are easily in the minority. You play as Link, a young Hylian boy who was raised in secret within the Kokiri forest. It becomes evident that Link is not one of their own because unlike the Kokiri, who are ageless children, Link never had a fairy guardian, and he was growing up. At the start of the game, the Great Deku Tree sends the fairy Navi to summon Link to his aid. The Gerudo King of Thieves, Ganondorf, placed a curse on the Deku Tree for not relinquishing one of the 3 spiritual stones. These stones are keys to the Sacred Realm and resting place of the Triforce, which grants the wishes of whomever touches it and transforms the Sacred Realm to reflect that person's heart. Link enters the Deku Tree, defeats the monsters within, thereby breaking the curse, and obtains the spiritual stone. By request of young Princess Zelda, Link must ensure Ganondorf's total defeat, so he goes on a quest to obtain the final 2 stones, one from the race of Gorons, who live in the mountains, and one from the race of Zoras, who live in the waters of Hyrule. Upon completion of his journey, Link returns to the castle just in time to see Zelda fleeing in exile. She tosses Link the Ocarina of Time and begs him to protect the Triforce and the Sacred Realm. When Link uses the Ocarina of Time to access the Master Sword, Ganondorf follows him into the Sacred Realm and claims the Triforce. Too young to defeat Ganondorf, Link is sealed away by a great sage for 7 years. When he awakens, he can properly wield the Master Sword to track down all the sages of Hyrule. By traveling back and forth through time and vanquishing the evils throughout the land, Link gathers the power necessary to bring down Ganon. Ocarina of Time is simply a fantastic game, through and through. I've always been a fan of fantasy adventures, whether they be in books or in film, but the Zelda series made it possible to live my dreams. It's a story that rings particularly true to socially awkward geeks like myself, the outsider who rises up to greatness despite the odds stacked against him. But Ocarina was so much more than that. Almost everything about the game was near perfection, at least for the hardware at the time. The story was deep enough to keep me invested, but not so long that I ever lost interest. The environmental puzzles in the dungeons are enough of a challenge for even players today, though the water temple, with its raising and lowering water levels, will forever remain a thorn in many gamers' sides. Each dungeon felt appropriately isolating, and at times, the game could be quite scary, featuring undead enemies like Wall Masters, Floor Masters, Re-Dead, and the now infamous Dead Hand. It was the first time players met Link's trusty steed Epona. Horse riding up to that point had not been done well in a 3D game, and many players, including myself, would just spend hours riding around in the large open fields of Hyrule. It was one of the first games to do lock-on targeting correctly. When Link would lock onto an enemy, the screen would narrow into a cinematic letterbox, which would give players the ability to strafe and roll around the enemy more dynamically. Instead of clumsily swinging his sword in the air, it made Link, and by extension the player, seem like the capable hero of time that he was. But most importantly, it was simply fun to play. Exploring every nook and cranny, firing a bow from horseback, jumping from impossible heights, fishing, toppling gigantic foes, zipping from rooftop to rooftop using the hookshot, and of course, defeating Ganon, the king of evil, was sheer escapism. When I replayed the game for this video, I couldn't help that I was wildly hooked on the game, not because I was riding on some nostalgia trip, but because the game held up so well 16 years later. Of course, I laugh at how terrible some characters look, particularly the large wingless great fairies hidden throughout Hyrule. It released at the dawn of video games entering the third dimension, so some allowances need to be given in terms of visuals. Despite a few rough edges, I can still easily recommend anyone who hasn't tried it to stop what they're doing, find a version of the game, and play it. The controls are spot on, the story is wonderful, the music is timeless. There's so little to dislike about the game, and so much to love about it. No matter what I say about the game, it can never do service for how much of an impact it had on legions of players. Technically, this is also the first game you ever played. When you saw me using the controller and making music with the ocarina, you demanded to try, and at 1.5, you stood on my lap, and in a fairy cave you played the ocarina for several minutes, fascinated by the sounds you could make with your hands. And as a joy that only parents understand, I loved watching you mentally piece it all together. Your mom wanted to kill me when she saw photographic evidence of the event later. Ocarina of Time is an amazing game that most will place in their top 10 or 20 of all time list. For me, it reminds me of my early years in college and that special time when I squished my finger. I suppose I need to scrape together some sort of lesson for this episode to turn my meandering rant into an exemplum. Hey, listen, the lesson is, if you're installing an attic ladder, first install some temporary support boards into the ceiling, then climb up into the attic and have someone lift the ladder assembly up, and then safely rest the stairs into the temporary supports. Drill some pilot holes, and then properly mount the stair assembly into the frame. Remove the temporary supports. You can then safely use the stairs without fear of mangling your finger. Love, Dad.